The scripture text for our message is from 3 passages. First, Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. The Lord has said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Second, Genesis 15, verses 18 through 21. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites." Third, Deuteronomy 30, verses 4 through 5. Even if you have been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. He will bring you to the land that belonged to your ancestors, and you will take possession of it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. The word of the Lord.
The sermon I'd like to share with you today is God's blessings for the nations of the earth. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is to start off with a simple question. How old is Singapore from our independence? Together? 57. Excellent. All of you are patriotic and nationalistic, and you know Singapore is 57 years old. I actually didn't know till I looked up. Recently, somebody asked me, how old is this piece of land? And I said, what do you mean, how old? I said, land is supposed to be indestructible. So it was here even Singapore became a state, It was here when Raffles came. It was here before Raffles came. And in that sense, Singapore goes way back, right? But the time when Singapore became, when we attained statehood, that is 57 years ago, right? 9th August 1965. Now, Singapore as a state, okay, I'm not going to ask, but I'll just tell you, okay, I'm older than Singapore. Some of you are older than Singapore, right? Yes, I like that. A strong affirmation. And I can actually boast and tell my American friends, when I was in America, I was already born when Singapore became independent. I was a child when I went to school and saw the transformation of the educational system in Singapore and all that. So I saw Singapore, I witnessed Singapore moving from third world to first world country. I could tell them that. They couldn't tell me that, of course. They cannot live that long. So Singapore is a very young country, and it's younger than many of us. And even though this is the way we attain statehood, nobody call it a statehood day. We all call it National Day. Okay? Now, the normal use of the word nation and state is kind of mixed up together. But there is actually a difference between the word nation and the word state. Now, so what is the difference between nation and state? Well, the first thing I want us to note is this. You see, if you were to look at old maps, okay, and one irritation I had looking at old maps is that there are no boundary lines. They would tell me something like, Kingdom of Judea, Kingdom of Samaria, Egypt. And I say, but where are the boundary lines? And there are no boundary lines. Okay, if you look at old maps, it doesn't even have to be that old. When you look at old maps of Singapore or Malaya, you'll find that there are no boundary lines. It's just general areas. So many of us don't even realize, and I didn't realize until much later, that actually boundary lines did not exist. And they are quite a new thing. It is a new creation that we have. And so what was happening was that there is always a center of government, right? So this important city like Rome or Carthage or any other important city. And as the influence begin to spread, they generally control the other cities in that area and the surrounding land. And sometimes between what we call country and another country, it is just desert land or non-arable, non-productive land. So nobody cares who owns the land because, it's just like no man's land. Nobody cares about it, okay? And this is why in the past there were no strict boundary lines. Now every piece of earth is precious because even though you cannot grow crops on it, you might find minerals in it, right? So people fight over high mountain passes and desert lands and all that. There's actually one piece of land in this world that I know of that nobody wants. It's actually unclaimed land. And today you can go and live there and say, this is my country. Okay, you go and find out what it is. Okay, but you should suspect by now that it is a terrible piece of land to be here. So that's why nobody wants to live there. Okay, so the countries that we know today are all very new. Most of them began to take shape after World War I in 1918. Okay. If you were to look at the world's map before World War I, you find countries like Austria-Hungary, which today they don't exist. There's no such country, right? You see Prussia, and these countries do not exist, okay? And most of them take their current borders only after World War II. And World War II ended in 1946. And let me just give you an example. The countries in Europe, until the Cold War and until let me give some examples of these countries in different places. Okay, so almost all the countries that you see in Europe today exist after World War II, except those countries that were not conquered, like Great Britain. Okay, all the other countries had their maps shifted. Now, the last acquisition of the United States, the actual borders of the United States, is only as recent as 1947. Okay, and that is how recent that is. Again, after World War II. When did India become independent? 1947. When did the People's Republic of China, when was it formed? 1949. The State of Israel, 1948. Indonesia, 1945. Philippines, 1946. The Federation of Malaya, 1946. And then, of course, it became the Federation of, it was started as the Federation of Malaya. It became the Federation of Malaysia with an S inside. Why? Because Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore were added in. So all the S's end up being added into Malaysia, right? So from Federation of Malaya, it became the Federation of Malaysia in 1963. And then after that, it became, Singapore got kicked out. So, we became independent in 65. Okay, so 63 to 66 was the Federation of Malaysia. So now that means that most countries today are 100 years old or younger. So now the question then is this: what is a nation? Okay. Well, the term nation actually came from the Latin nationum, which refers to birth or stock or race or people or species. Okay, so this is actually the meaning of the word nation. Quite different from our meaning today. When we say that, Singapore is a nation, we don't think of ourselves as a stock of people, right? Or a certain race. And this actually came from the Greek, which is the word ethnos. Until today, you still use this same word, ethnicity. Okay, so a nation of people is an ethnicity of the people. A race of people was called a nation. Okay, so again, a little bit different from how we commonly use it today. Now, so a nation, according to political science, is a culturally homogeneous group. The most common alignments are race and language. But it does not have the elements that make the people a state. So nation and state are two different things, at least from the point of view of political science. Okay? So what is a state? A state needs four things. Number one, a state needs a territory. You must have land that you call your own. Without that, you are not the state. Okay? Like the Jews were a nation of people without a state until 1948. Then they attained statehood. Okay? You need a population. You can have a territory. If you have nobody inside it, it's not a state. You need a government. If you have a whole bunch of people together but there is no government, it's also not a state. Okay? And you need sovereignty. So there must be internal sovereignty. So there must be a government that has an exclusive right to use coercive power. And you must have sovereignty to be able to relate to other states, to other entities that are of the same. Okay? So these are the four things that make up statehood. So now the question is this. How are nations and states different? Okay. And after a while, you begin to know why we need to go through this little exercise. Some of you may know all these already, but I think for many of us, we do not really study political science, right? And so we kind of need to put all these categories in its proper place. Okay. So how are nations and states different? Well, first of all, the state is a political concept. The nation is a cultural and psychological body of people who feel that they are one people. That's a nation. Okay. Laws bind people together in a state. A state is bound by laws. Sentiments and emotions bind people in a nation. Okay. So again, they are bound by different things. The unity in a state is imposed from above. It's imposed by the government. The unity of a nation comes from within the people. Now, we're going to look at some examples to make this clearer in our minds. The first example I like to think of is that there can be a nation without a state. So it's like the Kurdistan, for example. Kurdistan claims to be a nation, but they have no land of their own. And Turkey is trying to keep the Kurds from declaring a statehood because then it will carve out a piece of land out of Turkey, right? So that is an example of a nation without a state. And this today is the largest group of people without a homeland of their own. You know how many Kurds there are in the world? 30 million. 30 million Kurds looking for a piece of land that they can call their own, and they don't have one. Okay, so it's a little bit like Israel before they attain statehood. Now, a nation can have more than one state. So, for example, the Korean nation has two states. The Korean culture is one culture, right? One group of race of people called the Koreans. But they actually form into two states. It's broken up into two states. Okay? Or a state can have more than one nationality or a nation inside. An example is China. China is one state, but it has 56 nationalities inside it. Okay, so, and Singapore is also same thing. We are one state with different nationalities inside. Okay. So the rise of nation states, as we have said earlier on, the rise of nation states only began around about 1920. It really took on steam after 1946. People like to think that things evolved slowly. Actually, they didn't. There was this whole world order that came crashing down, and then a new world order arose. And this is the new world order that we see today. It is called the rise of the nation states, when nations became states. In the past, nations and states were two separate things, or they can be separate. But after World War II, nation and states became merged as one. And this is why today in our language we say we are a nation, when actually we mean we are a state. Because we are actually different nationalities within the states. But it got merged into one after World War II, and so this term became used interchangeably. And so we are not going to say that it is wrong to use the word nation in a non-technical sense. I'm not trying to argue that from today on we call it Statehood Day and not National Day. So that's not the point. The point is that we need to understand what the Bible means when it says nations. Because until I understood this, whenever I read in the Bible nation, I think of countries. Actually, I'm thinking wrongly. I have to change the word ethnicity or ethnicities. So when he's the Lord of the nations, it's actually he's the Lord of different races, not necessarily Lord of different countries. I mean, there are other places that say that, that he's God over every kingdom and all that. So the kingdom of the past is like equivalent to our state today. Okay, so meanings have shifted, and it is important for us to understand this. Okay, so why is it important to know? Well, it is important to know because the word nation refers today to nation states. Okay, and the Bible, when it talks about nation, it still uses the official term nations. The Greek word there is ethnos, ethnicity. Okay, so now let's see how this ties in together. You see how God's promise to Abraham is the start of the nation states. The nation states became a reality after World War II, but the concept actually began way earlier. It began in the Bible, interestingly. So this is what God said to the Lord, Hashem said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. Remember what a state requires, right? A state requires territory, it requires land. So when God told Abram, I'm going to give you a land, he's talking about statehood, right? I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. So a nation means a race, meaning out of you, I'm going to create a race of people. So you are going to be a distinct race of your own. You will have your own distinct language, your own distinct culture, your own distinct lifestyle. And so although you are one individual now, you will be a multitude of people, and you will be your own race. Okay? So in this promise to Abraham, two things are actually given. The promise of statehood and the promise of nationhood, as technically defined. A state has land and a nation has people. Okay, when you combine it together, you get that nation state. Now, that was what God promised Abraham. Now, this is significant but not totally unique yet, because there were lots of people governing over lands in the ancient world. But there is something very unusual about God's promise to Israel. Now, and first to Abram. And this is found in Genesis 15:18. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I will give this land. Okay, so God says, I'm going to give this certain piece of land. From the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. The land of the Kenites, the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. No parasites. Okay. But so what we have here is a distinct boundary that was given to Israel. So God specified, I'm giving you the land that is now currently occupied by these people. Last time they don't have, these GPS reference points. Huh? So God cannot say, how many latitude, how many longitude and all that. Okay, so it says these are the lands that are currently occupied by these people. Eventually you are going to take over their land. Okay, so that was a specific piece of land. Now, what is special about this is that God also told them what is not their land. Okay? And He told them these are the approximate borders. But then in Deuteronomy, He also said this to them. In Deuteronomy 2:5, do not provoke them, that is the Edomites, to war, for I will not give you any of their land, not even to put your foot on. I have given Esau the hill country of Seir as his own. So that is for somebody else. That's not for you. Okay? Then the Lord said to me, do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war, for I will not give you any part of their land. Okay? And in Deuteronomy 2:19, when you come to the Ammonites, do not harass them or provoke them to war, for I will not give you possession of any land belonging to the Ammonites. Now, let me tell you why this is so important. This is the concept of limited land. That means from this passage, Israel is forever forbidden to build an empire. Okay. In the past, when you are successful in conquest, you just keep conquering. You're on the road. You get this momentum, right? Rome was only a city. It became bigger and bigger. Moscow was only a small town when Ukraine was already Kyiv was already a major city. But Moscow began to grow militarily and began to conquer all the other places. And then you have Russian Federation, and then you became the Soviet Union and all that. But in the case of Israel, they were told very clearly that they are not allowed to keep conquering. Okay? They are not to be a warlike nation. They are not to use all these conquests to acquire more and more land. So there is a land given to them, and there's also a limitation given to the land. And this became the foundation, the Christian concept that empire building is wrong. Okay? As much as Israel became the model nation state for people, the theology of politics, as we may call it, is that we are not to be adventurous countries. Keep saying, oh, this guy is weaker than me. Let me go and, take over his territory. So Israel was specifically forbidden to do that. And I think what most people don't realize is that this concept of drawing your own boundaries and then limiting it is actually found in the Bible. Okay? And after World War II, this became a reality. And this is why I'm talking about the rise of the nation states. Okay? And this is why from World War II until today, we have had a period of unprecedented peace. Okay? I never grew up in war. You have not seen war. Why? Almost every generation has seen war. Do you realize that? Hardly anybody grows up without witnessing war, without being a part of war, without being a victim of war, or without having to kill somebody in war up until after World War II. And that is because of the final arrangement, according to the biblical concept, that nation states are to function. Okay, these boundaries are drawn, and even if they are not very well drawn, too bad you have to stick with it. Some people have complained about how poorly the British drew boundaries, because when the British Empire collapsed, and the land was given back to the locals, boundaries were drawn, and it was many times very poorly drawn and very vague, and that has given rise to more conflicts today. But the conflicts today are only border conflicts. Imagine the big difference between a border conflict versus a national conflict. It's just like two countries saying, the line should be drawn here, and another country say the line should be drawn there, and the dispute is only a small piece of land, like, what is that little island that Singapore disputed with Malaysia, right? It's that kind of thing that we are talking about today. The level of dispute is diminished. And this actually started with the Bible, because you know that no other country says that to the people, that, if you are strong, you keep conquering. Okay? And if you are weak, too bad, you are conquered by the other person. Okay? Well, here we have this very important principle. So this is ultimately contradictory to empires and to colonialism. Okay. Colonialism is a different form of empire building. It's just that you do not occupy the country and rule it as such. You appoint local rulers, and then you suck the country dry of all its resources, right? So that's what colonialism is. Okay. All right. So Deuteronomy 30. Verse 4 says this: even if you have been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. He will bring you to the land that belonged to your ancestors, and you will take possession of it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. So Israel was given a specific piece of land. It wasn't just any piece of land. It's not like, next time you just find any piece and settle there. But he says, no, you have to go back to this boundary. Now, let me give you an example why this is so important for peace. Okay, you see, Israel, after the October War, the Yom Kippur War, conquered a large swathe of Egyptian territory. Okay, and President Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, and I believe it was Begin of Israel at that time. These are supposed to be very hardcore people. And yet they could make peace between the two countries. Why? Because Israel has no mandate over Egyptian land. And so Israel gave up a piece of land that was, I think, at least more than the same size of the whole state of Israel at that time. Okay? They conquered this huge piece of land and they gave it up. And they could give that up because that was not their land. Because when they look to the Bible, they say, this is not the land that God gives me. This is outside of our boundaries, so we have to give it up. And this is why it is important that when we talk about a peace of nations, we really need to go back and see where did this idea come from. This idea of land that is rightly mine versus land that is not rightly mine versus the in-between part that might be a little bit disputed. Okay, but really that land that is mine versus land that is not mine. And you actually see this played out quite recently in our history. Okay, and so all these concepts were actually found in the Bible and being played out as after the Jews became a nation, and then they began to formulate and understand the limits of their boundary. Therefore, this is relevant to world peace. Okay, now, certain nation states do not respect the rights of other nation states, and so they are still thinking of the empire model. So, for example, communism. Communism does not think of nation states. Okay, communism thinks that it is their duty to keep conquering. Okay, so this is why communist countries like Russia today would invade Ukraine, because I don't respect you as a separate entity. I believe that you should be part of my rule, and so they go about conquering it. Okay, and this is also true of the Islamic State. Of course, the ISIS is no longer a significant power today. But when they were on the rise, you find that they didn't care, right? They didn't care about boundaries. They wanted to keep conquering. And because they have no respect of national boundaries. Okay. And of course, in Taiwan and China, they see each other as one nation. That means one ethnicity. But the question is it one state or two states? And that's actually the point. So when you hear America and China arguing what is the meaning of one China policy versus one China principle, they are actually talking about, both sides agree it is one ethnicity, okay? The question, the issue is this: China is saying it is one state. America is saying maybe not one state. Maybe it can be two states, like North and South Korea. There are two states, one ethnicity but two states. Okay, so therein lies this kind of origins of war, when states and national boundaries are not agreed upon. Then that is when people go to war. Now, what relevance is this to us in Singapore? Okay, well, first of all, there is a Malaysian recognition of Singapore statehood, right? So when Singapore got kicked out of the Federation of Malaysia, it became a independent city-state, and that is what we became. And in the Articles of Separation, Singapore was recognized. Okay, so there is legitimacy there. But every now and then you will find Malaysians behaving as if Singapore is not its own state, right? Every now and then something happens and they are not happy, and they still function in such a way as if Singapore is not its own state. One example is when Chaim Herzog, the president of Israel, visited Singapore in the 1980s. Then the people in Johor and Johor Bahru want to storm over Singapore because they say, how can you let the president of Israel visit you? The question is, why not? This is a separate sovereign state. Actually, it's got nothing to do with you. So they still cannot think of Singapore as a separate state, right? And so this is still very important and very relevant for us. So there are times from every now and then, sometimes for political reasons, politicians in Malaysia might, so to speak, resurrect or challenge the statehood of Singapore. Okay, Another relevance you see is in the Indonesia-Malaysia Konfrontasi, 1963 to 1966. So this is due to the non-recognition of the Federation of Malaysia, of which Singapore was a part at that time. Remember, we only came out in 65, right? And that led to the bombing of McDonald House, when the Indonesian paratroopers came and bombed Singapore, because they were opposed to this federation. And their main opposition really was that the island of Borneo belonged to them. Okay, not part of East Malaysia. And so most of the conflict and the fighting was done in the East Malaysia part of that region. But in Singapore being part of this federation, we also got bombed. Okay, and this thing comes up every now and then. Especially more with Indonesian politicians, I think. And not too long ago, in May this year, there was a preacher, well-known preacher in Indonesia, who was arguing that Singapore is actually part of Indonesia. So Singapore declared that this person is persona non grata, right? And said, sorry, you cannot come here and you cannot sing your song here in Singapore. So these things are still very relevant for us today. And this is why it is important for us as Christians to understand the idea of nationhood, of statehood, and the biblical principles behind it. Okay, that a legitimate state has its right to exist, its right to function, to live in peace, not to be molested, and not to molest others. Okay, so that is the biblical principle. So now, the Judeo-Christian values that produce nation states is God's blessing of peace to all the nations of the earth. So when God blessed Abraham and said, through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed, the core idea behind that, of course, is in Jesus Christ, who will bless all the nations of the earth. But then within this whole setup, you see the granting of land, you see the promise of a nationhood, of a race coming together. That also is a blessing to the world, which we are enjoying today in terms of peace. So then I'd like to simply make a few simple points. The first point is this. The nation-state model that God gave Israel is the model that brings peace. Okay? So that is one principle that we have drawn from what we have been talking about. The next one is that the nation-state model gives a nation-state sovereignty over a specific territory and rejects subjugation to another nation-state. Okay, so again, all these are principles from scriptures. The third is the nation-state model rejects imperialism or colonialism. Okay, we have talked about all that, but I'm just trying to summarize these points together. And the fourth is the right to territory in the case of Israel was a divine grant. The right to territory for the rest of the world is based on the free choice of a people group, of a nation, okay, to form a nation state through the settlement of territory. That means we come to an agreement, a settlement of territory. And the fifth point is the nation-state model does not allow a nation-state to abuse any nationality within its territory, because the state is there to protect that nationality within the state. Okay, so and this is why it's called a nation-state. It comes together as one entity. Sixth point is this: the nascent Judeo concept, meaning the small, the budding, nascent Judeo concept of the nation state was brought to effect when world leaders adopted Christian values and turned a concept into a reality. Okay, and this is where we enjoy peace today. And even though these Christian values on political governance are imperfectly implemented, they have already led to the longest period of world peace in human society. Okay? So just remember this. We are living in the longest period of world peace in human society since World War II. And that is because of this settlement of the nation states, which is actually a biblical concept that has come into fruition. So I'd just like to conclude by saying this, asking this question. How can I look at Singapore through the lens of Scripture? Okay. So first of all, I suggest this, that I'm thankful to God that even though Singapore is a secular state, Singapore has been instructed by many Christian values. In fact, there are so-called countries with Christian tradition that are a lot less, that have less Christian values than Singapore. Okay, so I think we can thank God where we are right now. Okay, and of course, these do not come about accidentally. These came about through several influences and through the legacy that Singapore has received. Okay, Singaporean Christians ought to be patriotic because the nation state was formed legitimately and has demonstrated a strong commitment to righteousness under which the Church of Christ has had room to flourish. Okay, so this is why we should be patriotic, because Singapore is functioning as a nation state, is doing what it's supposed to be doing, and therefore there is an obligation and there is a call to defend the country when the need or if the need arises. And the third point I'd like to share as a Singaporean is this. Singaporean Christians ought to be the moral conscience of our nation state, to uphold righteousness. Proverbs 14 tells us, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin condemns any people. So as our country once again goes through this issue of 377A, okay, Christians need to be the conscience of a nation. Christians need to say right is right and wrong is wrong. At the end of the day, we might be overruled, okay? But there is still that voice of conscience saying that we will not budge on what is right and what is wrong. The law can change, the law can allow evil, but it doesn't mean we need to agree with the law, okay? Like the law in Singapore allows abortion, and yet most Christians will agree that abortion is not something that people should be practicing because it is the killing of the unborn child. So the law being right does not stop us. In fact, it obligates us even more to be the conscience of the country. Even though Singapore did not at any time eye the territory of our neighbors, at least not that I know of, it is important for Singaporean Christians to disavow all illegitimate acquisition of territory. That means Singaporean Christians must be very firm that we are not going to eye other people's territory. Okay, whether you are in government or in a certain position and all that. Of course, everybody, we understand that in the military, you always have to plan for war. You always have to plan to fight in somebody else's territory. That is a necessity. But to steal another person's territory is a different issue altogether. Having to defend yourself, having to engage in warfare is sometimes a sad reality and a necessity, because not everybody recognizes or respects boundaries, right? So sometimes it's necessary. And yet we must disavow illegitimate ways of acquiring territory themselves. So then, in the hearts and minds of Christians, we must place a limit to patriotism. Okay? So many Christians, Russian Christians today, object to what Putin is doing because they are saying we have no business going into Ukraine. Of course, there are also Christians in Russia who don't care, who buy the state line, and that is not right. That is where we need to be the conscience of the nation. A person as a Christian should be patriotic to the point where when the country is in the right, to even lay down his life to fight for his country as the need may arise. And yet, we must not surrender our highest value. And life is not the highest value. Truth is the highest value. Okay, so we must not be afraid to say that even though I'm willing to lay down my life for my country, as the need may arise, and yet I do not surrender my conscience to the country. My conscience is not determined by my nation. My conscience is determined by the Word of God. So I hope you have learned something today. I know today's sermon is a bit unusual, to say the least, but I think it is sometimes good and useful to get into a little bit of theology, to understand why theologians argue the things they do. And of course, we have simplified it a bit. I actually have 2 main points, and this was only one of the 2 points. Then I decided, no, 1 point is enough. Otherwise, you'll stay here till tonight. So we may pick up another day. So I hope this has been useful for you in terms of understanding the world around us, as well as where our faith fits in to this situation that is around us. Let us look to the Lord in prayer. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen.
We hope you have been blessed by Pastor Peter's sermon. We'd love to have you visit us at thewell.sg. Have a wonderful week.